Anne, Anne Philippi, welcome to the TRYP podcast. It's an honor to have you here. You being a former GQ and Vanity Fair journalist,
Mhm.
I'd love to hear your perspectives today about psychedelic culture. You've been in the field for a while now. You've seen some crazy early day news, also some recent one. I'd
Yeah.
love to start this off asking you, what's the most amazing piece of headline you've read like in the last few weeks?
Okay, obviously, yesterday was really one of the biggest headlines. The US government basically signed an executive order to make psychedelic research easier, to allow it more, to invite basically companies to invest again if you want, and also kind of ask the FDA to be open to more research, which is the Food and Drug Administration, a very important institution in the US that would actually make psychedelic research and also psychedelic medication, if you want, possible again. And speaking of the headline, it was really wild. Saturday evening, our time in Berlin, reading President Trump has signed these executive orders. And behind him was Joe Rogan, a podcaster who basically did the first move towards informing Donald Trump about psychedelic research and how veterans could be helped that are suffering from severe PTSD and suicide. And also, these veterans with these really incredible nonprofits were there telling Trump, "Thank you, Mr. President." It was a little absurd in a way, but it also showed me one thing that I was thinking about the last couple of days. Like, I have not been in a more unpredictable and wild industry ecosystem like psychedelics, where things have happened in the last 5 years that people who started this, I think, didn't really expect in that sense to happen, or in that way to happen also. Because normally you were thinking, well, okay, there's a clinical trial, and eventually somebody accepts this clinical trial, and then there's an agency or institution like the FDA or the EMA that sees the trial and it's like, okay, we understand. So it's always felt like a very long process to make this legal. But suddenly now there's this other climate that is happening because people really start to understand there are not that much mental health tools anymore to help with depression and anxiety and things that we need to solve in our society. So, but coming back to your question about the journalism and the culture, so I mean, I think like 5 years ago, when I walked in Berlin on Torstrasse, people would ask me like, "Oh, are you high right now because you have a psychedelics podcast?" And of course, the answer is always no. But today, this is really different. So people suddenly start to reach out and say like, "Well, I read this," or "I have this family member. Do you think you could make an introduction to somebody?" So it is quite interesting how it became more serious in a way, or people take it more serious, the opportunities we could have to solve mental health problems with that.
Amazing. And this podcast you started a few years ago,
Hmm.
uh, maybe going back in time, what were you thinking back then? Like, I would reckon people would call you, as you said, like crazy or you're high. Like, what got you into this? And then how do you believe your work and also the cultural perspective, especially outside from only the pharma studies, how do you believe the perception of the public shifted then also policies today? Like, how would you explain this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I started it because I personally got into psychedelic therapy and experiences because I wanted to solve some questions that I was carrying around with myself. And pretty fast, this helped me to understand my current life situation then, or just in general, like looking back at into things or into my life that big parts I didn't really understand, to be honest. So, and suddenly I realized, wow, this is not just like something that you could eventually talk to other people about. I started to realize that it's a really severe transformation in mental health. And then also the pandemic started pretty much at the same time. I think that's when we also, around that time, met the first time. And it became very clear that there's a whole network of scientists, therapists, investors, like Christian Angermayer, famous German investor and driving force in the psychedelic biotech field. So, I mean, suddenly I realized, wow, there's a whole ecosystem and industry that needs to be presented or kind of made visible in a way. And a lot of these people are not coming from, let's say, content or journalism, so they were kind of a little known in their fields, but not really to a bigger audience. So, and me coming from journalism, from Condé Nast, from in the beginning Vogue, then GQ, then Vogue, Vanity Fair, GQ. I thought like, oh, how would it be if a podcast like that would look like as if Vogue would do a psychedelics podcast? And because it was the pandemic, which was weirdly full of opportunities, we had this great film team who normally would shoot for German television, but they had nothing to do. So we were
Mm.
like, okay, let's figure out a version that looks very high end and where people think they watch a Gucci interview. And it kind of really worked in a very strange way without me knowing that would work. And then Dr. Bronner's came on, the soap company, as a sponsor. We got a couple of even venture capital investments because we were thinking, okay, this podcast could be kind of a sales funnel, very early idea, which was way too early, but it was kind of interesting how many people started to understand
Mm.
what we were doing here.
I mean, you made psychedelics chic in a way, didn't you? Like before that, I
Exactly.
remember back in the times, it was like, like if anyone mentions psychedelics, most people would be like, "Oh, drugs," right? So it was this
Yeah.
very no, taboo, nasty kind of thing. And I
Hmm.
believe what you did is like is has such a value for the community as well. Like you took something, your own experience, and you had the
Hmm.
chutzpah to go out there as well, and like also maybe walk us through like your process of sharing also your personal view and also like maybe not just the studies and how this maybe back in the day was very unusual, but today it's becoming more like mainstream. Like, what do you think that happened that people now are starting to talk about this more and are daring to go out there?
Yeah, I think, I mean, at that time when I started, some people started to share their personal stories, and most of these stories were very much around depression and addiction, which of course is super valuable because a lot of people who have, like I said earlier, a family member or are themselves kind of struggling for a long time and they don't see any other opportunity anymore to make sure to save their lives, kind of. So that was kind of the first step when people really started to understand, like, okay, this is really, if this really saves lives, let's, why should we have something against it? But then it was also interesting to see that it not away from it, but it opened also up as to a tool for people to just look into their thought patterns, into things that were holding them back, and just kind of look at it as a very legit tool to kind of create the life you would like to have and just find out the life you wouldn't like to have, for example, which I think is totally legit also to use it for that. And of course, it is much more effective if you do it with a therapist, if you do it in the right set and setting under supervision. But it can be really powerful to open it up to a lifestyle you would like to have also.
Hmm.
No, maybe you would like to have. So, and I kind of like put my personal story in it because basically the moment I started the podcast, I also started my journeys. So I was always like, oh, let's see what the next journey brings. What could I talk to this time? So, and recently I just really started to understand something very important, that because I started my first journeys over 40, and then basically my whole life was like, okay, this is not the life you want, what you having
Hmm.
now, which is over 40 a different story than
Yeah,
If
sorry, I'm really curious to hear, like, how did you educate yourself back then? Like, who were your psychedelic
yeah,
role models, and like, who would you look for information for?
yeah, I mean, actually, I had kind of the first researchers, science that came towards me that I explored was the Imperial College in London. So they had launched a lot of studies in the, like a major study in 2020, I think, or they started it around psilocybin and depression, led by Robin Card-Harris and Rosalind Watts. So I think that was the first time I really started to understand with their kind of research, and Professor David Nutt was also involved, what this actually could mean. And then another inspiration, I have to say, was really, I think it was also in the pandemic, the Goop Lab by Gwyneth Paltrow, when they launched one episode just about psychedelics. And she and her content officer back then, Elise Löhnen, at least, they went with the whole team to Costa Rica to do a psychedelic experience and then talk about it later, what it had brought up in their team. And I thought, well, that's exactly how I would like to engage with this kind of like either, with people that I'm kind of close to or that I work with maybe, but especially also coming more from this angle, like what is holding me back and why was it holding me back? And in my case, I can just say I found out tremendous things that had happened to me a very long time ago where I never thought they would have such an impact on my life now, basically. So that is something that always inspired me. If people were open enough, coming from a more, let's say, luxury entertainment world, if they would be open enough to say, well, this is what I found out and I had no idea. So, and as we see also in the case of Oprah Winfrey, she had a couple of podcast guests, Michael Pollan, and also a woman called Amy Griffin, who talked about her MDMA experience with trauma. So that had a huge impact. And so Oprah has this book club, and it always happens in a Starbucks because she has a deal with Starbucks. So suddenly there was this live Oprah thing at the Starbucks in Chicago, and they talked about MDMA therapy. And I was like, that is how it should be. So if Starbucks is listening, hit me up.
Amazing. Maybe also for everyone like listening, what are some of the most remarkable things you found out about psychedelics along the way? Maybe some misconceptions you've also, or some myths you were able to bust through the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing that people say immediately is like, "Oh, will I become crazy or will I kind of be lost in the trip, so and never come back from it?" So, and I think that is a legit question because we all grew up with that narrative of the war on drugs, where this is your brain on drugs, like you see a fried egg and brain is basically gone. So, and of course, it is super important. And I'm really, it's a really important thing to say, to have a conversation with a guide and a therapist before you get into this, to really prevent you from having a really bad experience in terms of maybe having family history with mental health problems, but that actually that you stay in the trip, this is totally a myth, because the trip is at one point it's over, and then you might have had a very strong experience, which also necessarily is not a bad thing sometimes. But this is the number one thing. People think if they take one tab of, I don't know, LSD, they will stay in this forever. But that's not the case. So that's a very important thing. And then another important thing, I think, is to say that if you go on a journey and you have these experiences afterwards or these insights, it's not necessarily like in 2 or 3 weeks that you have, oh, I have these insights, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes this can take much longer, and you constantly start to understand things in a very different way, which can take a while. So it's nothing you can 100% predict when you have certain insights. And that is also something that's super important to accept, that it's not kind of an overnight thing. So
Hmm.
those two things I think are really, really important.
Beautiful. And from like your perspective, what are some things which are, I don't want to say like hot this year or trendy, but still, where do you see people or the shift? It can be also be subtle shifts in the
Mm.
industry. How do people, are there some routines, some things people are doing lately or you're
Yeah,
seeing?
absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, since also yesterday, since the government signed these papers, I think there is a much bigger openness or growing openness towards, let's call it psychedelic biotech, that it is really a thing and it's not just some company. And there were also three very big deals recently, rather in the biotech sphere, that actually were based on molecules that medication, if you want, in the end, around molecules that are not necessarily psychedelic anymore, that are just derivatives from a molecule. So there's one trend, if you want, that is called, you could call it like having a trip without tripping, or like the kind of, it's kind of a, how could you explain this? Trip-free psychedelics, which allows, first of all, to turn this into a medication. Second, you don't have to wait until basically there's a legal requirement to bring this into psychiatry. So if it's not a psychedelic with a psychoactive compound, you can just use it like a compound. So that is also something that is working very well. Like the companies start to look into other variations of molecules that are not scheduled, that are not kind of restricted by the law. And another thing that is happening, and that's also really interesting, is that the psychedelics world, but also venture capital companies in that world, are opening up to GLP-1s and peptides. So just today, I read a couple of articles again that there is some research coming how GLP-1s or certain peptides that are still, kind of being created or being researched, how they would also help with mental health problems, or
Hmm.
it could also be a mental health drug if you want. So, and that is something that's becoming super interesting also.
Interesting. So the first question or the first part of the answer to my question, I I totally hear what you're saying. So there is this trend to kind of recap. People are kind of scared of LSD because it's this really long-lasting trip. They
Yeah.
want some of the advantages or the kind of the bespoken advantages like neuroplasticity, but they don't want to be seeing all of these visuals, right? So how, and then maybe if we look at the like the two sides, there's like the ancestral tradition from plant medicine and then like spiritual beliefs versus like the clinical, okay, we have a single
Yeah.
molecule we extract and then even get rid of the visuals. Where do you stand
Yeah, I
on this
mean,
front?
yeah, no, I mean, it's a very important question because one of these first studies done by Johns Hopkins about around magic mushrooms was actually the outcome was roughly that people who had a spiritual experience or a mystical experience in that sense, that they would be less depressed or that depression had transformed. And the people who wouldn't have that experience, they probably wouldn't have that experience. So their depression was still kind of going. So actually, I think that's going to be a really important question, how this kind of experience you will have, how it really helps you really to overcome things or to really look into things. Of course, same thing the other way around. Will it actually really work if you don't have a mystical experience? I mean, there's of course already research around this. That's why these companies like Gilgamesh, for example, or Transcendent Therapeutics, they worked exactly on that question and still having clinical trials to do. Like, how does it actually work if somebody is not having a trip,
Hmm.
say? And of course, what you mentioned, the kind of the question around plant medicine, it's also a question that's a little bit, it's gone a little bit in the background of things right now. So because people are like, oh no, now is the whole pharma thing is coming and this is gonna make everything credible, but it is still a very different kind of context you need to put yourself into if you would go into a let's say plant medicine experience. And
Mm.
I mean that is something, now that we talk about it, I just realized that basically the communication around this conflict, like let's say plant medicine versus pharma, is a little bit in the background right now because everybody is very excited about the new legal kind of developments in the US.
Yeah, and then there are some things like peyote or like right, or DMT, and like
Mm.
their origins which are, I guess, problematic also for the reason of like scarcity,
Yeah.
and you have then also indigenous rights and like
Yes.
religious rights in the US and all of that. I mean, it's a very complex issue, isn't it? Where you have like political side and also like business. How do you think from now in 5 years psychedelic business will look like? And if we compare this to the cannabis renaissance, do you see this future as well for like other substances, or do you think we're going to take a different route here?
You mean in compared to cannabis? Is that what you mean? Like,
For instance, yes.
yeah. I mean, I was just at this cannabis conference here quickly last week in Berlin, and I mean, it's really in the beginning it was very much like a overlap a little bit, and but then it really parted ways with psychedelics in a way, because I find it's really a different world and becomes less and less comparable. But I think like in 5 years, I mean, as I said earlier, it's like the most unpredictable, volatile, if you want, or disruptive world. I think one of the things that's going to be super important, or that's already happening, is the role AI will play with this in terms of finding new molecules, having a therapeutical background suddenly, like you have an agent, like you're a psychedelic agent, for example, that you will talk to and that knows all your journeys, what you experience. And I mean, that's already, of course, people are already doing this just in a
Mm.
basic way. And I think like sometimes something about that is also very interesting. It's not necessarily all bad, but what I see is that if you don't, as a company or as whatever you do in that space, if you don't think with AI, people are like, okay, how do you think this is gonna happen in a couple of years? So that is something, that intersection is very interesting. And so last week, 2 weeks ago, I was at a agent building workshop with Claude and Anthropic, and I built a first kind of content studio for that kind of works around the stigmatization and the shadow ban on social media. So, and that
Mm.
is just like such an early, I mean, it's like, having Legos and put it together. But I think in a couple of and half a year, this is going to be fast forward. So I think that intersection is also something that I'm very interested in. So I think there will be a lot of companies that work. I mean, there's one company, I forgot the name now, but that Sam Altman invested in, that will accelerate clinical trials, or the time frame, how much time you normally spend on clinical trials. So all
Mm.
will be affected. Everything will be affected by that.
Yeah. From like a, let's say, beauty perspective, like alcohol is tabooed. I had Lars Müller say once, alcohol is a boomer drug, which I loved.
Oh, what?
Um,
Boomer
a
drug.
boomer drug, yes.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and I remember faintly reading something like you wrote on Substack about
Hmm.
like canna or something else, if it rings a bell.
Yeah. Hmm.
Is this like an alternative, or where do you stand today? Like, what are some things people may want to look into if they're cutting down or
Yeah.
cutting
I
completely
mean,
out of alcohol?
so obviously there's a huge kind of movement happening in terms of not anti-alcohol, but just replacing alcohol, as you said. And is this still okay with the sound?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Good.
So, and the one thing, the first thing that mostly happens if people go on psychedelic journeys for a while, or they make this part of their lifestyle, like a lot of people, including myself, almost like lose their interest in drinking. Like in a way, like party drinking back
Mm.
then, or you would go for dinner with friends, and the first thing is you have a drink, and then you drink even more at dinner. Like if I think about this time in Berlin 10 years ago, roughly, it was a completely different, it was such a big normality to just do that. And a friend of
Mm.
mine, she actually writes just a book about that. Because it's also a really big change in society, how people react to alcohol, all kinds of generations apparently. But what I find interesting is that most people report they don't feel the urge anymore to drink or to have alcohol somewhat involved, and which is interesting enough, the same thing that happens with GLP-1s, that kind of cravings, whatever they are, disappear, so to say. And that's wildly interesting to me how this actually will be kind of researched. So, but and then I think it's also that people start to understand that if you drink alcohol, your body shows you much more how much energy it needs to get rid of the alcohol, basically. And it's nothing kind of rational almost. It's also not something judgmental, like, oh, you drink it, you drink alcohol, you must be bad or something. It's just that
Mm.
the, your body just reacts to it and says, like, this is not, I don't want this, kind of. So, and I think this is still the case. And of course, like you mentioned Kana. Kana is kind of some people call it like a natural MDMA, but it is one of the substances that came forward, if you want, in the last couple of years that people take to go out and if they don't want to drink alcohol. So, and it's more like a social, how can we be social? There was also in cannabis the development of social cannabis. I remember like 2016, I wrote a story about this, like social cannabis with luxury tools. So that was the, and, and now it's like people take sometimes microdoses for of mushrooms to just to go out and be more social, and which you normally would do. Oh, you go somewhere, you have a glass of wine. Now you can be social. So it's a very interesting development, and obviously it's also very good for longevity if you don't drink a lot of alcohol.
Mm. I heard you speak earlier about like peptides and GLP-1,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess like everyone these days, you get like loads of news every single day about the new thing coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you as a journalist like approach this? How do you kind of quickly decipher the signal from the noise?
Yeah, I mean, you mean from these GLP-1 companies? Is that what you
Yes, or like exactly, or like how do you like figure out which is fake news, which
Oh, yeah,
sources to
okay.
trust, and
Mhm.
how do you, yeah, what's maybe like a compass you could give for people to also be able to yeah, learn from this and kind of be able to really yeah, mitigate the downsides, but still be on the cutting edge of culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you really want to use them for yourself, which is a different thing as if you would just, oh, should I invest in this? Or like, I mean, although I think like most investors are doing it anyway. Um, but I think it's always kind of important, I think, to see a doctor before you start to use it. I think that is really, I mean, like a year ago, 2 years ago, it was just Ozempic, and then it was like a huge portion, and some people had really big problems after taking it. But also some people who were really desperate to lose weight, they were very happy. So it was this kind of weird thing. But now, more and more, it becomes a almost like regular, I mean, of course, in America anyway, tool for many things, not only for losing weight, it's also for longevity, for metabolistic health, for kind of also saving your organs or to make them less, have them less aging over the years. So, I mean, it is super important to not, I would say, not go on TikTok and just buy something that you see there. I would really think it's still, I mean, a little bit like psychedelics, where it's good to consult before with therapist, ideally the person you're going to do the trip with. I think it's also good to consult doctors about your wish to take them. So I know, of course, in America, this is a different culture. Often people just see, well, this makes me look so and so. I'm just buy it, and it's super cheap. But I think it's still a good idea to pay attention. But having said that, I know this is not always easy to find people who would be, or doctors who are really kind of have the knowledge also about this, kind of who would be just like, yeah, you shouldn't do it because such and such. So, and that is also an interesting moment in terms of culture and creator,
Hmm.
because there are some people who have legit information. Sometimes they are doctors themselves, like, kind of influencer. I mean, influencer is a word that is so loaded, but they are kind of influencer doctors. And I think there are some, like, I mean, you could say Andrew Huberman is also somebody like that. There are some people on social media that are absolutely trustworthy, and they also wouldn't say, oh, you should take everything. Like, some people, for example, Tracy Sims is a, Stacy Sims, she is a kind of a Stanford professor, trainer, nutritionist. Like, there are some people out there you can follow and just read up as much as possible. But I know it's very confusing right now. It's a little
Hmm.
too much information.
Yeah, well, a good start is definitely your Substack. I can highly recommend, and obviously also your Substack
Oh yeah.
and the podcast.
Hmm.
I mean, you recorded over like I think 140, 145 episodes, if Claude is correct. From all of these episodes, what's one that stood in mind particularly, maybe that changed your mind?
So we are at the moment 120, I think. And before I say which episode, so we planning a relaunch with the new Health Club that is just what we're talking about, that will make the actually a bigger picture around this, like just include other topics like GLP-1s, peptides, longevity ideas, and psychedelics, but also what they will actually do to a culture. Not only like you should do this and then you stack it with that and then you take some mushrooms with this. So I think it's a really good time now to open up the conversation to other kind of biotech products, let's say. But the episode, I think one of the most important episodes was the one with Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, which is probably the biggest nonprofit in the space, kind of helping MDMA therapy to become legal. That's Rick Doblin's biggest goal, and he's doing this now for, I think, 40 years. And I think it was like the third or fourth podcast. And I mean, again, in a pandemic, everybody was just in their place. And I think I really started to understand the first time, like how that he really kind of he gave his life to this cause in a way. And I mean, he founded it under Ronald Reagan, 82. I mean, it must have been super difficult to keep going with this also. And so still, he is somebody, you can put him somewhere here at Hackische Markt and he would like be able to talk to everybody about MDMA
Hmm.
therapy and why this is great, but without being like a guru or something.
Hmm.
So, and I think that has opened up the idea that this is something that, I mean, some people really kind of took personal consequences to bring this forward. Like some people had to go to prison for a while, or for quite a long time even.
Hmm.
Some people kind of didn't have maybe the income that they would have, like, without doing this, because it's a very unpredictable kind of context, how much money you will have, how many donors will help you. It's like a company. You have no idea. So what's
Yeah,
gonna.
totally. And like with MDMA, it's interesting because we had also the Shogun Foundation here on the show, and like all of this would have never happened if back then they would have not rediscovered it again, all of that. So often it's kind of funny. You go back in time, and there are these little
Yeah,
coincidences, or maybe not, that kind of lead up to today, where we have people like Brian Johnson live streaming different psychedelics, right? And so
exactly.
I
Yeah.
totally get your shift going from like, okay, this is not just psychedelics, but now this is of the broad understanding of culture and like also longevity and health. This is kind of a conversation going into health, right? So your health club or the new health club, is this also like a community where people can interact, or like where were people let's say from reading get into action? Could they kind of enter this? Do you do meetups, or bring us through here also what you do?
Yeah, we opened last end of last year. We founded a nonprofit in the U.S. called the New Health Institute. And before I go back to the New Health Club, so the institute really was created or launched, thankfully, in the U.S. Because I realized the creation of content around this podcast and kind of other creator content is quite hard to make money with, or like you can't monetize it because you're kind of advocating for illegal drugs to make it true.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of shadow banning. There's a lot of brands that would say, well, we like what you do, but we can't support it because it's a compliance problem if we support illegal drugs, which sounds so harsh, but that's, legally
Yeah,
still a problem.
and you also don't get the views, right? Because the platforms will shadow ban
No,
you
you
as soon
don't.
as you're like,
I mean,
yeah.
it's really something I learned also in these last 5 years that you kind of can't put your finger on it unless they close your account.
Mm.
And for example, we started with a MailChimp. We got kicked out of MailChimp. So that's how I landed at Substack at the time when it wasn't Substack here. So long story short, so that's the reason why I opened a nonprofit. And we already last year, 25, we created the podcast with a donation. So for now, this is kind of a good strategy. And so then just recently we had this little tweak in a model that we actually decided to make the podcast profit, which is going to happen in relaunch probably in summer. And then 20% of that profit podcast would be pledged to our nonprofit, to the New Health Institute, where I already see that some topics you could not actually show or discuss in a kind of profit podcast or
Mm.
in general, which still needs to have a place where donors really see that there's a really big necessity to support this. And right now, like coming back to what happened yesterday or Saturday, in terms of Ibogaine and psychedelics in the US, I think it's even more important to create new models of communication and content that are not your typical either very sciencey places to go to or your typical kind of I'm so crazy, I'm on psychedelics to go to thing. And there's still kind of a very big need for this bridge to actually tell people what this is, but also to start building kind of monetizable models that maybe not now, but maybe in
Mm.
2 or 3 years. And I mean, we see with OpenAI or Anthropic, they also have still nonprofits,
Mm.
or OpenAI was even a nonprofit. So, and I think like the next 2 years are a very good time to, and you can do this if you have this in America, it's easier to look into what could be monetizable in the end and what will still need nonprofit money.
Oh, definitely, yeah, and it's happening so fast. Like a friend of mine, she's just launching a Canada drink in LA as well,
Yeah,
and I mean, it'd be unthinkable in Germany to mix like food and new substances, right? But in US, I guess anything goes, at least for a while. And
yeah,
it's gonna happen anyway, right? I think people from like
yeah,
there is critique always about like I guess things being commercialized, but that's just the
Mm.
way things are. And I think it's also like maturity of an industry and also safety. Like people want to be able to buy high quality and safe and yeah, wholesome experiences in a way, or just be able to also consult people, also just be able to get this information. And I love how you're basically curating the most important like news that's going so fast, as I mentioned, that you need to still be able to like decipher this, right? So it reminds you a bit of Tim Ferriss, like the human guinea pig, who then gives like a 5 minute Friday of like the hot psychedelic news and things to look out
Yeah,
for.
he's doing a good job. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
he's
mean, it's kind of, I mean, of course, that you could do this more. Like, I mean, Brian Johnson being live doing this, Tim Ferriss also. I mean, he had this really famous podcast. I think his best podcast where he talked about his personal trauma and then how he tried to work around this with psychedelics and meditation. So I mean, but so I think I also like I said earlier, the longer I do this, the more I realize my kind of target group, if you want, or people who mostly come to me and also ask like, where can you make a recommendation? It is really mostly people over 40 who have been in very high powered careers or still are, or carrying a lot of responsibilities still, and or just had a divorce or just kind of have a big life-changing event. And they kind of really start to understand that you could also use this as a support to make decisions that you might not be able to make because you had experienced things in your life that won't let you make these decisions. So that is something that becomes more and more kind of the core in terms of the eventually also business, which is a different thing than have creating content just around it. Um, but I find it more and more interesting for myself. Also, like, what if you over 40 you find out, wait, that this is really not the life that I want, although I keep pretending and I keep telling everybody. And why is it actually happening that, or why is that the case that I'm living a life that I actually don't want? So, and again, this is a very different question if you're
mm,
45 and if you have like eventually build a company, build a family, like live in a certain place where you think, yeah, it's better if I stay here because everything's set up here. So, I mean, I don't even want to call it like midlife crisis because it is stronger than that, I think, because a lot of people just build their lives on their trauma without knowing it, kind of.
mm. And I believe it's also it's a natural time when you either have children or not, or you have a job, or you know,
Yeah, yeah.
it's a life of change, and psychedelics can be a great catalyst for this to
Catalyst.
really show us. Yeah, a new path in life where you sometimes maybe stand there and things feel a bit dull and repetitive, right? So
Mhm.
I love this perspective you offer there, and I think it's very important that we have a lot of diversity and show different like stories, and everyone shares their story, right? It's not about like telling people what to do and what not to do. It's about
Yeah.
sharing, documenting your own personal view, curating interesting angles, and shifting the the voice of the culture. So last question for Dad have
Mhm.
then talking about how you're influencing this culture. What would you wish for in the next 1 or 2 years max? Like what are some things like midterm you'd also possibly hope for not to happen, or like what's your if you could move it the needle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really great if people could start to build real businesses around this also. Like, for example, one of the learnings we had in the last 5 years is that, and there are many other examples, that it's very difficult to run or open a retreat business where people actually, for a fair price, can go there and have experiences and experiences that are good, not like
Hmm.
in a mass container.
Yeah. It's the worst place to trip with 50 people in a room.
They also exist, but I'm not going to say what it is.
Yeah.
But so there was, for example, there was a really great company called Synthesis in the Netherlands, and it was one where my first psilocybin journey was, and it was really powerful there, and really great people, and everything was like wow for the first experience. long story short, they had run into several legal problems. They tried to move to America, didn't work out. So, although it was such a high quality in the beginning, it was very difficult to maintain kind of a turnover that they could show to investors that were credible. There was several reasons, but I thought it was a very good example of a kind of a gold standard offer.
Mm.
Didn't work out anymore, and so I think, like, of course, this is strongly connected to the legal scheduling, and which is still not untouched, although that what happened yesterday. So this will
Yeah.
still take a while. So, and I think, like, so this is something I wish more people could create, like legit businesses. And I also would like to see that a lot of people who make donations, which I start to see in America right now, that they understand what kind of a powerful tool this is also for a bigger health model, which again happened yesterday, that a government acknowledged the veteran community and them saying, look, we're just going to kill ourselves if we
Yeah.
keep working with the normal medications.
Yeah, and that's hopefully going to set up a new wave of investments because now people have the
Yeah.
regulatory security to know, wow, okay, there's going to be uh, a government or the society supporting this, the government saying green lights, and so yeah, the money, obviously, the resources to go in the right direction, and so anyone reaching out that wants to support the cause can, I guess, write you, right?
So, no, but also that Europe should be faster is also something. I mean, it is so,
Totally. I mean, and for this reason, we are in Berlin, all
yeah.
celebrating and bringing the culture to.
Yeah, it's great, the TRYP conference. I mean, it seems to be really big, right? I mean, it seems a huge thing.
Yes, and we're really looking forward to also inviting you and everyone
Yeah,
listening on the
very excited.
15th to 17th of May at Funkhaus in Berlin. It's going to be yeah, the biggest event about psychedelic science and wellness culture. Thank you again for taking the time and doing what you do, and for everyone reaching out. They can follow you on Substack and also listen to your podcast
Yeah,
on Spotify. Thank you so much for your work.
thank you.